Wednesday, April 29th, 2015. This evening, I watched Clandon burn. I got back from work around 7 p.m. and my mother greeted me at the front door, exclaiming, "Clandon's on fire." I immediately hopped in the car and drove to my favourite spot for a sundowner, the private drive that cuts through Clandon Park to Temple Court Farm, now the home of the Earls of Onslow, with wonderful views across to their former seat, the Palladian-come-Baroque Renaissance masterpiece in these Surrey hills. The sight that greeted me made my stomach churn. Flames licking their way up the insides of the red brick mansion house. Several fire engines and dozens of firefighters were trying to suppress the flames, but I could see that their efforts were in vain. The whole building was ablaze, and I knew immediately that nothing but a shell would remain. What was particularly strange was the eerie silence. The wind was coming from the west, behind my back and towards the house, meaning that I couldn't hear any of the noises from the fire or the firefighters. Sheep continued to graze in the park, oblivious to the chaos beyond the ha-ha. A hauntingly beautiful contrast between idyllic, pastoral country life and ensuing devastation. I stood there for hours, the spring sunshine diminishing and the night drawing in, yet the glow from the burning house cast long shadows across the park. Eventually, as the crowd grew, we were ushered away by the police and I returned home. As I write, I realise how ironic it is that in this, my first week in my new job at Country Life magazine, the house that has possibly had more influence on me than any other in leading me to where I am today is now no more than a shell. The smell of smoke lingers on my clothes and in my nostrils, and I'm simultaneously heartbroken and nostalgic. Memories of my time at Clandon Infant School playing in the grounds of Clandon Park, Easter egg hunts with my granny amongst the daffodils, hide and seek in the Maori meeting house. I end this diary entry with a final thought. I remember vividly the feeling of awe with which I first beheld Clandon's Marble Hall as a 5-year-old. Fresh off the plane from sub-Saharan Africa, I couldn't believe this room had been created by men, and that this house had once been a private home for the Onslows to enjoy. The detail and craftsmanship in that hall instilled in me such a love of architectural beauty that I feel sure I would not be working at Country Life today if it weren't for this house. I hope and pray that what's left of it is salvageable, and that, like a phoenix from the ashes, Clandon will rise once more to inspire others like it inspired me.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast. And thank you, Geoff, for that very beautiful diary extract in your own words. Not a poet this week, no great writer. It was your good self.
It was indeed.
Very lovely description of the fire at Clandon Park, which is the subject of the pod today, which we're going to be doing with Cornelia Van Der Poll, who is the founder of Restore Trust. And we're very, very glad she can join us to discuss this momentous building and subject. And I suppose well, actually, firstly, I'm quite surprised, Geoff, that it's beautifully written. What were you, about 5.5 when you wrote that?
Rory, I was much older. Rory, I'm old, remember. I'm a lot older than you. This was, I must have been 24. And I was going through that phase. I just started as my first writing gig at Country Life. So, of course, I was inspired that I was going to create my own sort of Chips Shannon diaries that would one day be published, of course. So I decided I would write. I started writing a diary that year with very conscious of how it might be published in the future. And of course, inevitably, because of that, I never really carried on. So
I kept a diary at the same time. It's much more glamorous than mine, which was sort of forgot to eat, stressed about.
No, you see, I love reading diaries. I love, my favorite book is one of my favorite books is the letters and the letters between Deborah and Paddy Lee Fermer, as we talked about before. So I often write. It's really bad, and it's why it's not sustainable. I often write in the style of those whom I wish to emulate.
Oh, very good. Very good. Well, anyway, it's very beautiful.
It was an extraordinary night, and one that will stay with me forever. And I'm looking forward to it.
You've captured the various themes we're going to be talking about. But so I suppose, without wanting to sound naive, how did Clandon start? What's the origin story?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rory. And I'll sort of run through the early phases of Clandon. Welcome Cornelia to the podcast.
Hello.
Cornelia will sort of step in shortly as we sort of move on to the present or more recent occurrences at Clandon. But the background is, so Clandon is in Surrey, which is one of the home counties for our listeners who aren't aware of it. It's to the west of London. It sort of borders London. So those of you who know Wimbledon, the tennis championships, which are in London. They're actually in Surrey because Wimbledon is part of Surrey, but it goes into London. So it's sort of parts of Surrey is suburban London, then it extends into the beautiful Surrey Hills, which are famous for being film locations because of their proximity to London. So places like Sheer Village, which is very near Clandon, where The Holiday was filmed, amongst others. So it's a very pretty part of the world, a lot of commuters, a lot of wealth. And Clandon Park is one of the great estates of Surrey. And the Earls of Onslow, who were the owners for the last 300 years or 400 years, were one of the principal families of Surrey. So I believe one of the Earls of Onslow gave the land in Guildford on which Guildford Cathedral is built. So there's a lot of old links between Guildford and I was brought up in Surrey after we moved to England from Africa, and went to prep school in Guildford. So I know the area very well. And Clandon is an interesting one because, again, because of its proximity to London, it was quite a strategic place. So it was listed in the Domesday Book as Clandon Regis. And there are some links to the Knights Templar in the medieval times. I believe the Knights Templar owned the land around there at the time. And that's the reason why the home farm at Clandon Park is called Temple Court, because of those Templar links. And that's the house where the Earls of Onslow now live, because they still own much of the estate, but not the house itself and the garden surrounding the house. And essentially, it went through a slightly checkered history, sort of early medieval through to sort of Tudor. It was passed through a number of families, sold a few times. By the Elizabethan period, there was a lovely but relatively modest Elizabethan house. We don't have pictures of it. That was a secondary home of the Weston family. Now, the Westons were a very old, established Surrey family, and their principal home was an extraordinary house, which is still in existence, called Sutton Place, which was about a 10-minute drive from Clandon. And Sutton Place is one of the great Elizabethan stately homes of England. It's a prodigy house. It belonged to John Paul Getty, the great American industrialist, and it was featured in the film about him, and it now belongs to a Russian oligarch. But it's a really, really beautiful estate. And Clandon was their sort of secondary home, but became the Westons' principal home when they basically couldn't afford to run Sutton. They sort of shuttered it up and moved to Clandon. And then in 1641, enter the Onslows, who I believe were originally from Shropshire. And they were a political family. And Sir Richard Onslow, who was MP for Surrey during what was known as the Long Parliament. So the longest parliament that's ever sat without a general election was the parliament that ran from 1640 to 1660, when Charles I was restored to the throne. Sorry, Charles II was restored to the throne.
And you and I sat on very different sides of that parliament, didn't we, Geoff?
We didn't we? Well, the Onslows are parliamentarians and roundheads like myself. I imagine, I suspect, Cornelia, are you a Catholic?
I'm sitting this conflict out, thank you.
Rory and I have ongoing Roundhead Cavalier debates on this podcast.
Geoff is a horrible regicide, and I support the true king. There we are.
Well, let's say my head is a Roundhead, my heart is a Cavalier.
Oh, that's a terrible response.
No, that's great. That's great. You know what? That sounds like Rory's family, who flip-flop consistently to keep their lands over the centuries between Protestantism and Catholicism.
Now, play nicely. Play nicely.
Sorry, Rory.
What are the phrases of it onto you?
So Sir Richard Onslow, during this long parliament, he was MP for Surrey, and so he bought his Surrey estate, and he bought the Clandon Park estate off the Westons, and he ended up dying in 1664. So after Charles II had been restored, and about 20-something years after he had bought Clandon, and his son, Sir Arthur Onslow, inherited. And now what's interesting here is we see over successive generations the sort of social mobility of the Onslows. It's a reminder that a lot of these families and family homes, family seats, is not necessarily, doesn't all come in one generation, like the Duke of Marlborough, for example, getting Blenheim and the title and everything in one go. Most of these families, it was successive generations. You know, they climbed the peerage steadily and so forth. And we see that with the Onslows. You know, Sir Richard Onslow was a knight. His son Sir Arthur Onslow became a baronet. His son Richard became Lord Onslow, Baron Onslow, and he was Speaker of the House of Commons. And then it went to his son, the second Lord Onslow, Baron Onslow, Thomas, who died in 1740, who commissioned a new house to be built in place of this Elizabethan house. So the Elizabethan house was demolished, and they commissioned a remarkable Venetian architect called Giacomo Leone in the late 1720s to design a new house in the Palladian style at Clandon to keep up with the latest Whig fashions. Again, this is interesting. We've talked a lot about that shift from English Baroque to Palladianism, sort of pioneered by the likes of the Fitzwilliams at Wentworth Woodhouse, who literally built a Baroque house and then stuck a Palladian facade on the back. And the reason why, of course, is because the Whigs were the great party in England, and the Onslows were Whigs. And it became very fashionable for the Whigs to become slightly more pared back and discreet in the early 18th century. And so Baroque fell out of fashion and Palladianism came in. But what is interesting about Clandon, and that is what I'm keen to talk to Cornelia about, is how Clandon is a slight blend between the two, which is quite interesting. And so, Cornelia, can you tell us a bit now, as we sort of launch into the house as we know it today, or knew it until 10 years ago, can you tell us a little bit about Giacomo Leone and describe the house he built?
Yes, well, Leone wasn't just an architect. You might call him a scholar. He produced the first translation into English of Palladio's 4 books of architecture, and he also produced, I think, an edition of Alberti. So he really knew his theory. And yes, a Venetian through and through. I think Venetian is really the word that captures him, because he's so strongly influenced by Palladianism, well, by Palladio's own work that we see, in places like Vicenza. There are all sorts of villas that you could cite, that could be said to have influenced the various facades of Clandon House. And the facades are fascinating. On the west side, you have the pediment and the grand staircase and the entrance that leads you into the marble hall. And it's amazing how he hints from the outside at what is inside. And then on the east side, you've got the more restrained facade that leads you into the Palladio room. And then on the south side, you have the giant Corinthian order of pilasters. And on that side, you've got the library.
Mm.
But
it's lovely, isn't it, Cornelia? Just thinking about that, the pilasters that you've got on that, is it the south facade, which I think is the prettiest facade. I think that's the general consensus, is the south side is the prettiest facade. But
that's right.
You mentioned the pilasters, and what's interesting is they are capped with Corinthian capitals, which again is quite unusual for Palladianism, because the Corinthian order was more associated with the Baroque, and often in Palladian houses like Lyme Park, for example, which Leone worked on, which for our listeners, if they're not sure about, Lyme Park is that enormous house in Cheshire, which featured as Pemberley in the 1995 Colin Firth adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. And that's a very restrained Palladian house. And what's interesting with Clandon, with those Corinthian capitals on those pilasters on the south front, is it's just a nod to the Baroque. Again, I mentioned that he sort of blended the two. But there's a nod to Baroque. And then what I love even more is this: it's a really pretty facade, because the whole house is built in red brick with this wonderful stone dressings. And a lot of the house, the stone dressing is quite pared back. So all you see is maybe a bit of stone around the windows, and then stone balustrading. But what I was just going to say is, on either side of these pilasters, there are actually these stone swags, aren't there, above the windows? So it really adds a bit of flamboyance and interest to what could be quite a severe house. Is that fair, Cornelia?
Well, yes, but the house is severe on the outside. In spite of all that, because you've got the arched windows on the piano nobile. Then you've got pedimented windows on the, I think, east side. So yeah, you're right. There's a lot of decoration and a lot going on. But at the same time, the overall effect is very, very austere. And that's designed to contrast with the interior, of course. And I mentioned how the exterior prefigures the interior. Because when you then go inside, into the marble hall, you hinted at this in your introduction. The effect is really quite aesthetically overwhelming, and it is that really unexpected blend of the Palladian, the neoclassical, and the exuberant Baroque that's done so cleverly. The effect is at the same time cool and classical, but also very, very intricate.
It's true. It's true.
But
And what is interesting, again, it is not just as the exterior plain in its decoration, it's everything about the house is plain in its format as well. Even for Palladianism, often Palladian houses would have flanking wings or gazebos or colonnades or something, on either side of the central house just to soften it a bit. Whereas what's interesting is is literally just a rectangular block, isn't it? It's a perfect rectangular block, red brick, stone dressing, stone balustrade. And before the porte cochere was added, which we can talk about later, it was a very plain front with just essentially this central 3 bays faced in stone. And then as you go around the house, a few additions of stone dressing. And apart from that, it's all red brick. Although we have talked, interestingly, Cornelia, in the past about the softness of red brick. And therefore, whilst it's severe, it's also warm. And again, that contrasts the color, the brightness of this red brick contrasts again with, as you walk into that marble hall, what you see. And so, Cornelia, can you describe, because the marble hall is really the pièce de résistance of Clandon Park. Explain a bit about the history of the hall, its significance, and what it looked like, really. What's it comparable to?
Yeah, sadly, we have no drawings, so we can't really retrace the design process, but we're fairly certain that it was executed by Giuseppe Artari. Probably Artari, and maybe not his sometimes associate Barghouti. And it looks as if probably it was designed to some extent by Leone, and who knows at which point Artari might have taken creative control. But as I say, the effect is at once restrained, but at the same time, there's a lot going on. So you have architectural elements around the walls. You have pilasters, you have pediments, and of course the 2 fantastic chimney pieces with marble reliefs by Ricebrack, which are still there and actually in perfect nick. It's amazing how they survived. And then you look up, and then the fun begins at the level of the corners, where you have these male nude figures. It's a bit like the Sistine Chapel, overlapping, kind of almost like Atlas figures carrying the cornice on their shoulders with their legs dangling down. So you have these formal elements, but then you have sculpture kind of softening the edges of that. And then lots of decorative elements, lots of moldings, swags, foliage, and so on, shells. And then this leads your eye towards the center, where you have a roundel. And in the roundel are the 2 figures of Hercules and Omphale. And that brings in all sorts of interesting themes about love and slavery, because Hercules was a slave to this Queen Omphale. And there she sits with her leg, they're naked with her leg over his leg, and wearing his lion skin and holding his club. And this image is taken from a painting by Annibale Carracci on the ceiling of the Palazzo Farnese in Rome. I'm guessing probably people like Artari would have had engravings with them of paintings like this that they could work from. And now this whole ensemble has been likened to the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza by Palladio. And the similarities are quite striking if you look at it. The effect of the classical elements, but adding up to something quite intricate.
I thank you for that description. That I think captures it very well, and it is an amazing space. I think I'm going to speak bluntly. I think much of the outside looks like a bit of a barracks, frankly. But I think that the whole is amazing and all the more enhanced because of it. But the hall is extraordinary. To my mind, it's very similar to the one at Houghton, but in a way more exciting because it's more white. Houghton's is a sort of creamy, like grey color, whereas it sparkles, or it did sparkle. That Clandon Hall. I mean, I think the easiest way I can describe it, to my mind, is it feels. It's a strange thing to say, but it feels a little bit like walking inside a Viennetta ice cream, which is sort of white and full of ripples. And I think it must have been very sort of, quite literally refreshing. I mean, cool, lots of marble, light, just a very a kind of aesthetically cleansing experience to be in that room.
Yeah, and a very Italian room, maybe more suitable to the Italian climate. And you mentioned the stone hall at Houghton, and that, of course, has the balustrade, the balcony going all the way around, which I think creates rather a fussy effect. I think the genius of the marble hall at Clandon is that, whether I guess Leone decided not to put too much stuff in there. As I say, a huge amount going on, but none of it gives the effect of being fussy. It's, as you say, clean and refreshing in its effect on the viewer.
Yeah, it's almost like a sort of, both those halls actually, they're almost like grottos in the center of the houses because of this cool quality. And I don't know, it's quite hard. I mean, I haven't quite got the vocabulary to describe it at the moment, but they do feel like interior, exterior spaces, probably because of the use of stone. But I mean, incredibly dynamic. Very, very. It's sort of the thing that you get all those amazing Vanbrugh halls, the kind of Baroque halls, which are very powerful. And then I suppose later on in the century, you move into these Palladian halls / late Baroque Palladian halls, which are just very light. Anyway, sorry, I'm not expressing myself very well. Do carry on. Forgive my intrusion.
No, Rory, you're spot on, and it's interesting when Pevsner was writing about Clandon, he also highlighted, and I think he used the word. I'm trying to remember the word he used, but I think he described the exterior of Clandon as austere, but then the interior he described as exuberant, and so it's that wonderful contrast. And I think that what was so brilliant, I think, about Leone's design was, I suppose how Holcombe is another example of a house that's very austere on the outside, and then you walk in and there's that remarkable hall with all the brown and white marble and the stairs, and again it's almost a jewel box, but with a plain hidden in plain sight.
I think someone said something. It might have been Jeremy Musson actually on one of his programs, but someone said, or I don't know who, maybe he was quoting someone, that the Palladian style is meant to perfectly encapsulate the English temper. On the outside, you're sort of austere and unapproachable, and rather sort of formal, and on the inside, you're kind of, mildly Bacchic and colourful and sort of quite fun. And that was supposedly an encapsulation of the English spirit. Anyway, so
it's interesting. You're right, and you get that in the sense. I was reading when I was doing some research on Clandon. It's described as early Anglo-Palladian in its style, but that interesting idea of the I think it was described as chaste, restrained decoration, subtle temple motifs, married with one of the greatest Anglo-Baroque rooms in the Marble Hall. And interestingly, Rory, you mentioned Houghton. Interestingly, Sir Simon Jenkins believes that the plasterwork at Clandon was better than that at Houghton Hall. And I think originally, am I right, Cornelia? Originally, there was also a salon which was known as the Cube Room, which was an additional room pre the 19th century changes. There was a second extraordinary room within the house that was also sort of the full length of the house that was a cube. Is that? I don't know. Was that still there when the fire happened, or had that been changed?
Well, there were some changes changes made in the 1770s, 1780s. And some proportions were changed then. And I think in the Palladio room, there were pilasters around the room, and the door cases and fireplaces were in different places. And so, but quite a few changes were already made as early as I think 1779 thereabouts. At the same time that the fourth Baron, the fourth Lord Onslow, commissioned the park from Capability Brown, and that of course completely changed the outside and the setting, and swept away the servants' quarters and stables and so on.
Interesting. And so what we see then, just sort of running through the history, so this extraordinary house that was very plain on the outside and then remarkably exuberant on the inside, was built by the second Lord Onslow, the Baron Onslow. And just going back to the plasterwork in the Marble Hall, I believe Leone imported the best plasterers, and you mentioned his name. I can't remember. Was it Battista?
Yeah, Giuseppe Artari. He was one of those
specifically, didn't he, to work on this house?
Well, yeah, he worked. Actually, he did a lot of work with James Gibbs. For example, he did St. Martin in the Fields. And I would urge anybody who's interested in this extraordinary art of stucco to go and look at St. Martin in the Fields and look at the putti on the ceiling, because they're all individual and they're so beautifully sculpted. And then he also did the rather plainer Radcliffe Camera in Oxford with Gibbs. And also Moor Park in Hertfordshire, which is now a fabulously glamorous golf club. But they have a few days.
It also had Moor Park. Also, I think, had a staircase painted by Thornhill, didn't it?
Yes, that's right. Some fantastic paintings by Thornhill, and it's really worth joining the tours. There are just a few days a year when you can go to Moor Park. So that was done by Artari. We think probably the more repetitive elements, particularly lower down, were done by local plasterers.
Okay.
And that Artari did the more intricate freehand sculpture. But it's not just the Marble Hall. There are.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell us about the staterooms, and can you then tell us a bit about how the interior was changed and updated in the 19th century? But go for it about the staterooms first. What were the key staterooms?
Right. So if you went up the west through the west main entrance, up the stairs, and you mentioned the horrible porte cochere, which we shall now expunge in our mind's eye, so that we just have Leone's beautiful Venetian facade. We go in there to the Marble Hall, and then directly behind the Marble Hall is the saloon. So these two rooms form a suite. The idea is that you might assemble in one and then have dinner in the other. And then you've got, flanking the saloon, you've got the green drawing room and the bedroom, the state bedroom, where they actually the hangings of the state bed were not damaged in the fire. They were all packed up and quickly whisked away. And so that's actually a bed that predates the house, but so beautiful and so expensive that it was put in there. And this bedroom has a plasterwork on the ceiling that alludes to love and marriage. Venus in the center, lots of putti, satyrs. And then, as I said, the green drawing room. And then you also have on the ends of the house, you have on the one side the Palladio room, again with very intricate plasterwork. And then on the other side, the speaker's parlor, which was used as a dining room. That's the room that survives, and that's going to be restored, whatever happens. And then also the library. So we think Artari probably worked on all of these rooms, or almost all of them, because there's really lovely high quality plaster work throughout this suite of staterooms. So, it's not just the marble hall. The marble hall makes sense as the centerpiece of a suite of rooms. It's not just something standing in glorious isolation by any means.
Okay. And how then was the house reconfigured? I know it was reconfigured in the sort of Adam style, but not by Adam. And obviously Adam was himself a classicist, and so it wasn't like a total overhaul, was it? Like some houses had in the Victorian times. It was still done in keeping with the sort of classical style that Giacomo Leone had sort of envisaged. But how was the house reconfigured in the 19th century? And then later, I think the porte cochere was added in the late 19th century. Can you just talk us through the additions and the changes?
Well, not very much. The ceilings are original. At least were original. As I say, it's only really the one room. When the room was redecorated in the 60s by John Fowler, they found that behind the paneling, there were different door cases, a different configuration of fireplaces. But actually, apart from fairly superficial redecoration like new wallpaper or fabrics, that sort of thing, actually there wasn't significant amount of new material introduced. Now, Clandon House is the only complete surviving country house by Giacomo Leone, or was. And it's remarkable that the interiors survived to the extent that they had, pretty nearly in their original condition.
And that's because I think Wyatt changed Lime Park, and he didn't work on many other houses, did he, Giacomo Leone? So and he was one of the earliest proponents of Palladianism in Britain, was he not?
Yes. Well, he did build some other houses, two in Lancashire, which were since demolished in the 20th century, and some other houses heavily altered, or I think at Lime Park he only worked on the existing house, is that right, rather than build anything new. So in that sense, pre-fire Clandon was unique and really very important.
And in terms of as you said, the changes in the 19th century were not huge, and very much in keeping. I suppose the only exception was this porte cochere I mentioned, and we've talked about a porte cochere being in the past. A porte cochere is essentially a very large extended porch that sticks out in front of the house to allow carriages to go underneath, so that they could climb out of their carriage and enter the house without getting their hair wet in the rain or whatever. That's right, is it not, Cornelia?
Yeah, and that particular, I think it's something like 1869, 1860s when it was added. That porte cochere completely wrecks the proportions and the effect. Rory alluded to the house being a box. I think he was a little bit unkind about the exterior of the house. It may be plain, or austere, but it is highly refined. But the porte cochere just kind of rips
it's clunky,
up.
Isn't it? It's clunky.
Yes.
And interestingly, right, a little bit like Buckingham Palace, where the front facade is faced in Portland stone, and then the rear facade is sort of Cotswold stone, and so you have this contrast, which always I find jarring at Buckingham Palace, between the sort of shimmering silver of the front facade, and then you go around the side, and suddenly there's the yellow Cotswold stone. And actually, we see that at Clandon as well, because what I find infuriating is the original stone dressing on the front of the house, which is sort of encases the front three bays and the pediment, is in a lovely soft sort of silvery limestone, and then the porte cochere is a different stone, isn't it? It's a much yellower, orangey.
Yes, it just jars in every way. I think John Cornforth called it a disastrous addition, which I think is rather well put.
I suppose wonderfully it was an addition, so if had things worked out differently, the owners might have been able to remove it and return the house to how it had been. But that's obviously the debate we have. Yeah.
A bad porte cochere is a bit like it's the architectural equivalent of a sort of bad nose job, isn't it? It's sort of it's something which is designed to improve, but actually becomes a horrible eyesore.
It's true.
So there we are. That was Clandon's nose job.
Yeah, absolutely. And
well,
so
I mean, they did it for convenience and comfort, I suppose, staying out of the rain rather than aesthetic considerations.
Yes. Well, no, I'm sure that a beautiful nose also has its practical functions as well. But I don't want to digress us into a comparison on.
I was going to sort of run through quickly because we haven't touched on the grounds yet, which interestingly were totally re-landscaped, potentially by Capability Brown. It's not certain, but they've been attributed to him. And this links nicely with our recent episode we did on Capability Brown and the picturesque English landscape that he sort of pioneered. And what's interesting, I mentioned that there wasn't much evidence of the Elizabethan house. There was one painting of Clandon pre-Palladian, and that's a painting dating from 1708 by a Dutch painter called Leonard Kniff. I think I assume the K is silent, but which is a really interesting painting because it's one of those sort of bird's eye, sort of late 17th, early 18th century sort of country house portraits where it shows the entire landscape laid out in avenues. And so what you see in this extraordinary painting of Clandon pre-Palladian house is, again, red brick, a red brick house, but it's very pretty. It's a bit like Hatfield. It's got sort of two projecting wings, then a forecourt with a sort of stone colonnade and these wonderful Dutch gables, and then surrounded by these very smart formal gardens, square lawns, parterres, knot gardens, and then beyond that are these avenues running out on the four axes from the four facades of the house. With very formal planting, formal canals, and all the rest of it. And then what's interesting is in the late 18th century, whether it was Capability Brown or one of his followers, someone came in and sort of swept all that away and created the picturesque landscape that Clandon has had ever since. Although I think sadly in recent years it's somewhat declined and got a bit overgrown. But what so we saw sort of the creation of this Palladian house and then the creation of the park, and then we talked about the 18th century when the porte cochere was added. Sorry, the 19th century. What's interesting is the 19th century was kind of the peak of the career of the Onslows, really, as well, wasn't it, Cornelia? Because I think the fourth Earl of Onslow became governor of New Zealand. And
yes.
Tell us a bit about some of the New Zealand memorabilia that he brought back.
Well, the most famous souvenir that he brought back is, of course, the Maori meeting house, which he put in the park and which created a lovely eye catcher from the house.
Which it looks a little like a sort of, well, it's sort of little. It looks like a chalet but thatched, doesn't it?
Yes.
At a time, I suppose, when other Victorians were following in the footsteps of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and having Swiss cottages built in their grounds, the Earl of Onslow went for something slightly different in the form of his Maori meeting house. And there was also, I think, a grotto and various other things in the grounds. And then in the house itself, can you tell us about the collection as it was at its sort of peak? Tell us about the grotto.
Right. So the grotto was created to act as an eye catcher from the house. And there are straight lines from the first and second floor window, well, the ground first and second floor windows, towards this grotto in the garden. And the point is that I think it's easy to forget that that things were designed to be seen from certain places. And so, it's not just this room, it's not just its decoration, it's not just the building, but it's also what it's like to be in there and what you see when you're in there. All of that, as I say, was carefully thought out. And we'll talk later about the particular issues with what the National Trust proposes. But I think that's often lost sight of, that the house sits in a context. Even if this particular landscape was created after the houses we have, it nevertheless, they were designed to form a whole together.
Yeah, that's true. And the house sat very nicely within its landscape in a really lovely part of the world. And I suppose it continued. I mentioned the fourth Earl, I think, was around sort of in the second half of the 19th century. That was sort of the peak, like for a lot of country houses, because then we enter the early 20th century and we get to the First and then Second World Wars. Both times the house was requisitioned by the government. So I think the first time round in World War One, it was turned into a military hospital, ironically, for New Zealand soldiers. I don't know if that was because of the New Zealand link or not, but over 5,000 wounded New Zealand soldiers were treated at Clandon Park. And then the family, of course, tidy things up again after the First World War, moved back in, only for it to be requisitioned again in the Second World War, where it was used for various purposes, including as a command post and a training centre. And this is where we really see Clandon Park following the trend that so many country houses went through, the decline of the country house after the Second World War, because, again, apart from the astronomical death duties and the collapse in land prices and all the rest of it, there was also the additional fact that this house was left in a pretty terrible state after it had been requisitioned. And so I think it was not long after that, in the early, so many country houses, as we know, at this point, post-Second World War, the families couldn't afford to move back in. They couldn't afford to make it nice again. And so they basically demolished them and sold the scrap, which is why we had that tragic period known as the destruction of the English country house. Mercifully, Clandon Park never went through that because it was gifted to the National Trust, or gifted to the nation through the National Trust in 1956 by William Onslow, the 6th Earl. Cornelia, can you tell us a bit about that bequest? What did it include and why was it made?
Well, it was made quite simply because the family just couldn't afford to keep the house any longer. And I came across a novel, actually, which describes the dying years of country house life at Clandon by Teresa Wall. It's called The House, a very charming novel which describes how the situation goes backwards, as the family tries to maintain its aristocratic way of life, and yet financially falls further and further into ruin. So, as I say, a novel well worth seeking out.
So a jolly read.
And that ties in quite nicely, because I think Lady Teresa Wall was a daughter of the 6th Earl of Onslow. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yeah, she was daughter of the 6th Earl, but she married Oberon War, who himself was the son of Evelyn War, who famously wrote Brideshead. So it all sort of ties together with Evelyn War writing this book about Brideshead and the decline of the English country house, and his own son marrying the daughter of someone from a house that is declining. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, quite a step up for Evelyn War, I'd say. What happened was the National Trust, for very good reasons, couldn't just accept this pile, in a ruinous state from an impoverished family, just like that. They needed an endowment. And so the Countess of Ivy, who was a relative, stepped in and gave a donation of £1 million, which was an astronomical sum of money. And this enabled the National Trust to take on the house. So I think what we often lose sight of is that these families made very substantial financial sacrifices in order to keep their house from being demolished and in order to keep it for the nation.
Yes, that's a good point. But can you tell us now? Shall we address the?
Let's fast forward to 2015. Yeah. So the trust were custodians, have been custodians ever since, have they not?
Yes. Yes, they did. They had to do a lot of work before the house could be shown to the public, and indeed to make it watertight and secure. So they put on a new roof in 1958, which a flat roof. Of course, the original roof had ridges. Quite a clever system of 3 groups of 7 tiled little ridge roofs. The idea being that the roof would be invisible. All you'd see when you looked up was the balustrade. You wouldn't see the roof. But anyway, this was covered with a flat roof in 1958. And the National Trust then redecorated the interior. This happened throughout the 1960s. And this was done by John Fowler. So what you saw then pre-fire when you went to visit was Fowler's idea of how to spruce up the interiors, bring them back to something like their former glory. He had to make all sorts of choices of paint colors and wallpapers and fabrics and so on. So you got not exactly what the Onslows left us, but a kind of impression of the house in its heyday, but working with the fabric as it was at the time. Very well done by John Fowler.
Which is quite common to the National Trust. I mean, they often have to do this, I think, when they're having to, for example, I don't know, interpret a room which has been lost and try and give a sense of what it might have been like. I mean, that there's sort of, and actually, funny enough, they've recently done this at Castle Howard, haven't they, Geoff? When they've recreated that Baroque room. Very few sort of ideas of what it really looked like, but they've done an incredible job at recreating the sense of a Baroque room.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That was done by Francis Terry, and the plasterwork by Philip Gatchers. Absolutely superb. And that room at Castle Howard, the what do they call it? Tapestry room or the cabinet room?
Tapestry drawing room, yeah.
Tapestry drawing room. That's not really an attempt to recreate what was there particularly, which is why some people, when these plans were formulated, some people were worried about it. Is it the right thing to do? I mean, it's been a triumphant success, and they quite consciously set out to create, as you say, an impression, something in the style of Vanbrugh. What would Vanbrugh do if you commissioned him now, perhaps, rather than to try to recreate what was there?
Yeah, but it's interesting, Cornelia, thinking about the idea of recreating after the fire. So the fire happened in 2015 during these restoration works, but it wasn't the first time in recent decades that the National Trust's properties have been subject to a significant fire. I think Uppark in Sussex had an enormous fire in the 1980s or early 1990s.
Yes, that was 1980.
And we saw that house restored completely. They'd almost completed the restoration when it burnt to pretty much a shell to the same level that Clandon is now. And so why do you think it is? I mean, getting a little bit more into the debate surrounding Clandon and the controversy surrounding it. In fact, let's pause the Uppark thing for a second because it links with it. Can you tell us, Cornelia, what is the debate surrounding? So the fire happened during restoration works in or because of an electrical fault in 2015, I think they said it was. But and it was basically all that's left is a shell. Very little is left. Slight bits of plasterwork and cracked fireplaces, and a lot of the collection was lost. I think a beautiful painting by Johann Zoffany of the Matthew family at Felix Hall in Essex, a painting that I think the trust got a £5 million payout just for that painting alone. So a lot of the collection was lost. A lot of it was also rescued by volunteers. I actually remember, Cornelia, during a tour of Clandon Park when I was a child, the tour guide showing me the dagger that was hidden behind the painting in one of the rooms, so that if, heaven forbid, there were a fire, they would cut the canvas out of the frame and get it out the window. And I thought that was fascinating. And of course, I'm sure they had to use that when there was the fire. But all that really was left was a shell, and some of the contents were saved. What is now the controversy surrounding the National Trust? They were paid out by the insurance company, and I believe, if I'm correct, that the condition is that money has to be spent on the house, because I think the current Earl of Onslow famously soon after fire said he didn't want the house to be restored. The shell would speak as a testament to sort of the outcome that some country houses face, and that money should then be spent on other houses, restoring them. And they were told, no, that money has to be spent on Clandon. And therefore now there's a controversy surrounding how it's restored and what happens to it. Can you just give us a bit of context of what that controversy is and what the different opposing views are? Yeah,
well, Lord Onslow has a certain point. He is he's thinking in terms of value for money. And of course, we are talking about very large sums of money here. And so he's worried about, what's the best outcome really for the nation? How can you best apply this money? The controversy, if we just take a step back, perhaps, so you say the fire started as a result of an electrical fault. Yes, it looks as if it was an old fuse box that probably should have been replaced. There's a lot about the causes and aftermath of the fire that haven't been made public. But what we do know is that there was an electrical fault in the basement, and then the fire spread up a lift shaft. And so one question is why this lift shaft wasn't blocked with a proper fire break. And then it went up the house and through the roof. And so another question is, why was the roof not compartmentalized? A sensible precaution is to create these breaks so that the fire can't spread rapidly. And yet there was nothing stopping the fire spreading, and it spread extremely fast through the house. Of course, another question is why there wasn't a sprinkler system. Given that this happened after Up Park burned down in 1989 and opened to the public again in 1996, why were lessons not learned and applied? Now, one big difference is at Up Park, as you mentioned, the fire was caused during renovation work. And this meant it was very clear who was responsible. And so the builder's insurer paid out in full. And what that meant was that at Up Park, money wasn't an issue. And the decision was made at Up Park to restore the house to as it was the day before the fire. Not make any changes, really just put back what was there. And that was because the contents were mostly saved at Up Park and you needed somewhere to put them. And it made sense, the debate was had, but it made sense at Up Park to put back the accretion. The interior has changed a lot over the centuries. It's a late 17th century house, but with additions over time. And it made sense to reflect all those additions again. At Clandon, the fire was more severe. Now, the National Trust did try to sue the company that installed the lift shaft to try to get their insurer to pay for a complete rebuild, restoration. And the sum that they claimed was £115 million, whereas the sum that the National Trust eventually received from its own insurer, because that lawsuit apparently didn't succeed. So the sum they received from their own insurer was, I think, 66.4 million.
Yeah.
Something like that. Now, the National Trust has never talked about the money, except to say that they want to use it, on Clandon, and maybe they feel obliged to do that. Maybe they really have no choice, whatever the case. But so the question arises: is that significant? The fact that they got 66.4 million, is that 66.4 million not enough to do the whole restoration job? Well, what we also know, what they've also said, was that they've spent in the region of 20 to 25 million on the recovery, on the scaffolding, and also on some restoration of the exterior brickwork.
That's so far. So far they spent 20 to 25 mil, basically, ensuring that structurally, ensuring the house won't collapse, and the scaffolding and all the rest of it. Okay, so and they got a 60-something million pound payout, so they've got essentially the money left over. Just in a nutshell, so we don't get too nitty gritty, because our listeners are very varied and all over the world. So in a nutshell, the controversy now is surrounding what they spend that remaining 40 million quid on. Basically, do they restore the house to as it was when the fire happened, or do they restore it to how it was when Giacomo built it, or do they leave it as a shell, or do something unusual with it, which is kind of what the National Trust is pushing for. So just in terms of the two options, because I don't want to get we've got about 5 minutes left, so I don't want to get too into the nitty gritty. But in essence, am I right, Cornelia? There are sort of two opposing schools of thought. There's the National Trust are pushing for this sort of basically to spend the remainder of that money on a sort of modernist, accessible sort of educational centre with glass walkways and gangplanks and all sorts within a burnt out shell. Others, I suppose you could say, people like yourself and myself, traditionalists who recognise what a special architectural place Clandon is and was, and who have seen the success of Up Ark, want it to be restored to as it was, whether pre-fire or Giacomo Leone's plans. The third school, which I think the Earl of Onslow's in, which he's the only one who's in because he can be, is that it is a travesty that I think the recent article said he doesn't want them to restore the house, but the National Trust plans are a travesty. So there are some people who actually aren't that fussed about how it's restored. They just don't want all that money to be wasted on all these contemporary things that have nothing to do with the history of the house. Is that fair? Those are sort of the different schools of thought.
Yes. So what the National Trust is proposing, as you say, is to put, their reasoning, the story they're telling now is the burnt out ruin is so fascinating that we want to keep it exactly as it is. And then people can look at this burnt out brick and they can see, as the National Trust put it, how a country house was built. Now, this is a complete U-turn from what they said after the fire. After the fire, the Director General then was Dame Helen Gauche, and she said, this is an opportunity, I completely agree with her, an opportunity to take the house back to how it was, to Leone's original conception. So an opportunity to reverse all of those alterations, the new interiors, and to take back those rooms to their original proportion. Now, there are several issues here. One is to do with planning. Planning policy states that you have to preserve and enhance the significance of a listed building. Now, the significance is obviously the rich interiors created by Leone and Artari. Now, why does the National Trust not want to put these back? Well, I think that's a good question. And the answer may be ideological, because what they've now done since they've unveiled their new plans is to try very hard to justify what they're doing in terms of planning policy. And what they've come up with, I'm afraid, is rather absurd. They say the fire has created a new significance. On the 10-year anniversary of the fire, they even sent out a newsletter talking about the transformation, the transformative fire. A little bit of regret, a lot of celebration of this transformation. I think that is a strange attitude to take. It's as if they regard Clandon as a kind of ancient ruin of a civilization that's gone and vanished. They're treating it as like the baths of Caracalla, rather than a house. The thing is, all of these techniques that we used to build Clandon are still around. They may be endangered, it may be difficult to get the craftsmen, but we can still do all these things. The National Trust...
I think that ties in nicely with one of the arguments for why Up Ark was such a success as the restoration, isn't it? Is because so many craftsmen who were perhaps encouraged a new interest in traditional crafts. And what you saw with Up Ark, the restoration of Up Ark after fire, not only the best craftsmen across the country in their respective fields, the best plasterers, the best carpenters working on it, but them also bringing in apprentices and training up the next generation. And ironically, it's that next generation who are coming towards the end of their careers now, who would themselves be training up apprentices in the process of restoring Clandon Park. Now, Cornelia, we're short on time, so I'm just going to sort of cut you short there. I hope you don't mind. You've given a really helpful overview, but what's really interesting is I met you through Restore Trust, which is the organization you set up kind of off the back of this controversy surrounding how the National Trust should address Clandon. Can you just, in a couple of sentences, explain what Restore Trust is, what its vision is, and why it was set up?
We set up Restore Trust before the National Trust unveiled its scheme for Clandon, because really on the back of a leaked report that talked about the National Trust dialing down its role as a cultural institution. And we became very worried about how the National Trust was changing its approach to country houses, how it saw itself not really as a custodian of country houses anymore. Focusing more on its commercial side, also focusing more on countryside. There were hints that some houses wouldn't open to the public anymore, or that public opening hours would be drastically reduced. And indeed, you can't visit our park this year without booking. So, some of our fears have come true.
So it was sort of, so you set up Restore Trust after the fire happened, but before the new plans were unveiled. And it
right.
Coincided,
yeah.
did it not? Did it not? Cornelia, coincided, did it not? The last 15 years, the National Trust has not shied away from controversy, not only when it comes to Clandon and its restoration, but all sorts of other politically motivated initiatives they've encouraged that have been controversial. And look, I think it's quite obvious from past episodes, Rory's teased me about these in the past for what side I take. But essentially, Restore Trust was set up, am I right in saying, because there is a consensus amongst many of us that the National Trust, whom people trusted to be custodians of their ancestral family seats and homes, has politicized their role and has shifted their focus away from what they were set up to do, which was to be custodians and guardians of our national heritage and our country houses. And instead, their focus is on lobbying, on on influencing policymakers, on making money, and on being accessible at the expense of being educational. Is that fair?
Yes, of course, grants for changing the way they farm, very detrimental to farming tenants, for example. But coming back to the presentation of houses, a lot of the presentations become activist. So as you say, with a particular political and social slant. This is not appropriate because the National Trust is supposed to be looking after these places on behalf of the whole nation. Now, they very much focus on telling stories. I think there's a kind of panic in the National Trust. Oh my goodness, these houses aren't actually that interesting. How do we keep people interested? I think there are people in the National Trust who don't believe in their heart of hearts that old houses are really fascinating. And so they try to tell stories, and then as fashions change, the stories become more politicized and distorted. And I think that's something that's gone very badly wrong in recent years.
Thank you. Well, I find the work of Restore Trust really interesting, and I know every year you give National Trust members guidance in terms of who to vote for and what to look for in board members at the National Trust and so on. So I would encourage our listeners to look up Restore Trust. Does restoretrust.org.uk or .co.uk?
That's right, yes.
.org.uk. Look up Restore Trust, have a read of what they've said, come to your own views and opinions on the debate surrounding Clandon and other things. That everyone's entitled to their own views, and absolutely read what Restore Trust has to say, please. And really, we just sort of wait with bated breath to see. I think the National Trust plans have been approved, but they've still got to go through certain loopholes or whatever it is. Hoops. They've got to jump through certain hoops still. Is that right? So,
well, where we are now is the Guildford Borough Council has approved the plans, which I think is a disaster, because the National Trust is effectively wasting tens of millions of pounds on a scheme that's unsympathetic, that doesn't do the house justice. And so this has been approved at council level. However, we're waiting to hear whether the Secretary of State will call in the plans. That's important, because if the application is called in, it'll then be decided at a planning inquiry. Okay. And so far, they've hardly been scrutinized at all. What we desperately need is proper, well-informed scrutiny. We need people who understand what's involved, to go over these plans and give their opinion in detail so that a properly informed decision can be made. And that's what we cannot get from a planning committee. With the best will in the world, a planning committee is not set up to design something, to decide something this important and this complex. So we really need experts to look at it.
Yeah, well, we wait with bated breath to see what happens to Clandon. And I hope, 10 years ago, I watched the fire burn that house to the ground. I'd hoped that in 10 years' time, I would have been able to see something's happened. But the debate is ongoing. Let's hope that in another 10 years' time, something's happened. But let's hope it's the right decision. And with that, Cornelia, thank you so much for your time. It's been a really interesting episode. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Rory, as always, for co-hosting this with me. Thank you to our lovely listeners for joining us, and please do join us again next week. And on that note, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.